Beneath a sky filled with smoke, gunfire, and a barrage of arrows, 210 soldiers from the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, faced off against thousands of Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne warriors on June 25, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River, in what is now Montana. This confrontation was part of a broader conflict between the Plains Indians and U.S. forces, centered around control of the Western Territories, a series of events known as the Sioux Wars. Within less than an hour, the Sioux and Cheyenne had secured victory in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, wiping out Custer and all of his troops. Though the battle has been famously glorified as Custer's last stand, the reality is that Custer and his men were never in a position to truly defend themselves. George Armstrong Custer, born in Ohio in 1839, initially earned a teaching certificate in 1856, but his aspirations reached beyond that. In 1857, he enrolled at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he graduated at the bottom of his class in 1861. With the outbreak of the Civil War, Custer joined the Union Army Cavalry, where he demonstrated his abilities as a competent commander in key battles, such as the First Battle of Bull Run and Gettysburg. During the war, Custer gained a reputation for his courage and earned multiple promotions. Despite many of his horses being shot out from under him, he sustained only one injury. His aggressive pursuit of the Army of Northern Virginia is frequently cited as a key factor in bringing the conflict to a close. Known for leading from the front, Custer never hesitated to fight shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. In 1864, Custer married Elizabeth Bacon, and by 1866, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, assuming command of the 7th U.S. Cavalry. He relocated to Kansas with his wife and participated in the Plains Indian Wars, where his leadership and bravery once again set him apart. The Great Plains represented the final stronghold for Native Americans in the United States. Prior to the Civil War, while settlers pushed into the far west, few chose to settle in the plains due to its arid conditions and significant indigenous presence. However, after the war, as land in the far west became more limited, the U.S. government allocated 10% of the plains to settlers and railroads. This set the stage for an inevitable conflict between the Plains Indian settlers and government forces. By the late 1860s, the majority of Native Americans had either been driven onto designated reservations or killed. Determined to avoid this fate, the Plains Indians prepared for a prolonged and intense resistance. In an effort to undermine the livelihood of the Native American tribes on the plains, the U.S. government permitted railroads to decimate large buffalo herds to make way for tracks. Additionally, they encouraged hunters to kill as many buffalo as they could, without regulation, and even prompted trains to stop, allowing passengers to slaughter the animals for sport. As the white colonizers continued their senseless slaughter of buffalo, indigenous anger intensified. In response, some tribes launched fierce attacks on settlers and railroad workers, regardless of age or gender. To the native people, the railroad symbolized the destruction of their way of life, as they had depended on the free-roaming buffalo for survival for thousands of years. By the time Custer arrived in 1866, the conflict between the U.S. Army and the Plains Indians was already raging. Custer's initial assignment involved supporting Major General Winfield S. Hancock in a high-profile campaign against native tribes. However, by the end of the campaign, Custer abandoned his post and rejoined his wife at Fort Riley. As a result, he was court-martialed in 1867 and suspended from service for a year, stripped of his rank and pay. Despite the shock and disappointment his desertion caused among his men and superiors, the Army's need for Custer's leadership remained. In September 1868, before his suspension had fully expired, he resumed duty and took command of the 7th Cavalry. By November, Custer had led a severe assault on a Cheyenne village led by Chief Black Kettle, resulting in the death of all the native warriors and cementing his reputation for ruthlessness. In the following years, Custer realized that combating Native Americans presented challenges quite distinct from those faced against Confederate soldiers. Native warriors were dispersed, adept at riding swift horses, and had a superior understanding of the terrain compared to Custer. In 1873, Custer encountered a group of Lakota attacking the Northern Pacific Railroad survey at Yellowstone. This was his first meeting with Lakota leaders Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, though it would not be his last. At that time, Custer could not have known that these two indigenous leaders would later play a significant role in his eventual downfall. In 1868, the U.S. government signed a treaty that designated South Dakota's Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. However, in 1874, the government reneged on this agreement when Custer led a group of miners seeking gold into the Black Hills, sparking a significant breach of the treaty. Custer was assigned the task of relocating all Native Americans in the area to reservations by January 31st, 1876, with non-compliance deemed as hostility. However, the Native Americans did not accept this mandate passively. Many who were able left their reservations and traveled to Montana to unite with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse at their expanding camp. This coalition, numbering in the thousands, eventually established their encampment along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. The U.S. Army sent out 3 columns of soldiers, including Custer and his 7th Cavalry, to round up indigenous people and return them to their reservations. The strategy involved Custer's cavalry and Brigadier General Alfred Terry's infantry meeting up with troops led by Colonel John Gibbon and Brigadier General George Crook. Together, they aimed to locate the Native Americans, encircle them, and compel their surrender. Crook experienced delays, but Terry, Custer, and Gibbon managed to converge in mid-June. After a scouting party discovered a trail leading toward the Little Bighorn Valley, they decided that Custer should advance, encircle the tribes, and wait for reinforcements. Custer pressed forward, but the operation did not proceed as anticipated. Around midday, on June 25th, his scouts identified Sitting Bull's camp. Rather than waiting for reinforcements, Custer decided to launch a surprise attack the following day. He expedited the assault when he believed the Native American forces had become aware of his position. Custer split his over 600 men into 4 separate units. He instructed one small battalion to remain with the supply train, while the other 2 groups, commanded by Captain Frederick Benteen and Major Marcus Reno, were to approach from the south and prevent the tribesmen from fleeing. Custer himself would lead the final group of 210 men and planned to launch the assault from the north. Reno's group struck first, but quickly fell into a disorganized retreat upon realizing they were vastly outnumbered. By the time they managed to regroup, at least 30 of their men had been killed. Benteen's troops arrived to support Reno, and together, the combined battalions took a defensive position on what is now called Reno Hill. As the sun rose over the mountains on the morning of June 25th, 1876, the banks of the Little Bighorn River were shrouded in the dark clouds of impending conflict. George Armstrong Custer, leading the 7th Cavalry Regiment, anticipated a legendary victory. However, he faced a formidable alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, whose very names evoked fear. These tribes had come together to defend their land, freedom, and survival. Misjudging their strength and resolve, Custer expected only a small contingent of adversaries. Yet that day, the ruthless hand of fate would weigh heavily on both sides. As the battle commenced, Custer's men advanced toward the riverbank, only to be met with fierce and relentless resistance from the Native American warriors. The Lakota and Cheyenne, drawing their horses tight and spreading rapidly across the valley, unleashed battle cries that drove the cavalry into a frenzy. Custer's once orderly ranks were quickly shattered by the sharp arrows and gunfire of the warriors. The battle's intensity surpassed any notions of heroism or strategy. It was a raw struggle for survival. Overwhelmed by what appeared to be an unending assault, the cavalrymen swiftly dispersed in the face of relentless enemy attacks. As Custer attempted to regroup his men, the battle's brutality escalated with each passing moment. Neither side offered any quarter. The Native American warriors moved with remarkable speed and precision, coordinating their attacks from horseback and unleashing a relentless barrage of arrows and rifle fire on the cavalry. Every sound of hooves and battle cry heralded imminent death. As Custer's forces fell one by one, the battlefield became drenched in blood, a grim testament to the ferocity of the fight. Even Custer's valiant efforts could not change the ferocity of the battle. Death was pervasive, and as the soldiers fled in panic, the Native American warriors swiftly pursued them, offering no mercy to those trying to retreat. Custer, along with his most dedicated men, found themselves cornered on a hillside within the valley. Despite their desperate fight for survival, they were no match for the overwhelming force of the native warriors. As ammunition dwindled and bayonets were rendered useless, the grim reality of the battle became undeniable, a scene dominated by blood, sweat, and death. By the end of the day, the 7th Cavalry Regiment had been utterly annihilated with no survivors, including Custer. As the Native American warriors celebrated their hard-fought victory in defense of their land, the battlefield lay strewn with the bodies of Custer and his men. While this victory was a significant triumph for the native peoples, it also foreshadowed the impending challenges and greater calamities that lay ahead for them. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is etched in history as one of the most brutal and violent conflicts ever fought. On both sides, the battle brought nothing but death and suffering, leaving a lasting legacy of its ferocity and tragedy. In the end, Custer was left defenseless with no place to hide or escape, and he met his death alongside every man in his battalion. His body was discovered near Custer Hill, also known as Last Stand Hill, amid the bodies of 40 of his men, including his brother and nephew, as well as numerous dead horses. Custer had sustained 2 bullet wounds, one near his heart and another in his head. It remains uncertain which wound was fatal or whether the head wound occurred before or after his death. Amid the chaos of battle, it is unlikely that the warrior who shot Custer was aware that he had just killed a prominent U.S. Army figure. Nonetheless, once news of Custer's death spread, many Native Americans claimed the honor of being his executioner. Following the battle, Native American warriors stripped, scalped, and dismembered the bodies of their fallen enemies on the battlefield. This practice may have been rooted in the belief that disfigured souls were condemned to wander the earth eternally. The precise details of Custer's last stand remain unclear. It is known, however, that neither Benteen nor Reno came to Custer's aid. Despite later admitting they had heard intense gunfire from his position, Custer and his men were left to confront a large number of Native American warriors on their own. Some historians suggest that many of Custer's soldiers panicked, dismounted from their horses, and were killed as they tried to flee. The exact moment when Custer realized he was in dire trouble remains unknown, as no survivors from his troops were left to recount the events. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, led by Crazy Horse, mounted their assault using Winchester, Henry, and Spencer repeating rifles, along with traditional bows and arrows. Most of Custer's men were equipped with Springfield single-shot carbines and Colt .45 revolvers, which left them at a severe disadvantage. They were quickly outgunned by the Native American warriors. As the battle progressed, Custer's line and command structure rapidly disintegrated, leading to a chaotic situation where it became every man for himself. The Battle of the Little Bighorn didn't end with the massacre of Custer and his men. The Native Americans swiftly regrouped and pursued Reno's and Benteen's battalions. The fighting continued until General Terry's reinforcements arrived. Faced with this new threat and now outnumbered, the Native Americans dismantled their camp and retreated, bringing to a close the most significant defeat of the U.S. Army during the Plains Indian Wars. The Sioux and Cheyenne savored their victory briefly, but their freedom was short-lived. When news of Custer's death reached Americans celebrating their nation's centennial on July 4th, The call for retribution grew strong. The U.S. Army escalated its efforts to track down all resisting Native Americans, aiming to either eliminate them or force them back onto reservations. Within a year, most of the Native American resistance had been quelled, with many either rounded up or killed. In May 1877, Crazy Horse surrendered at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, where he was subsequently bayoneted and killed following an altercation with an Army officer. After seeking refuge in Canada, Sitting Bull eventually surrendered in 1881 and lived on the Standing Rock Reservation until he was killed by Native American police during a confrontation at his home in 1890. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, fought in 1876, stands as one of the most violent and tragic confrontations in American history. Led by General George Custer, the U.S. cavalry was met with fierce resistance from a united force of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. This clash represented a brutal struggle for control of the western frontier, and the outcome was far more devastating for the U.S. Army than anticipated. The chaos and brutality on the battlefield resulted in deadly consequences for both sides. Native American warriors, determined to protect their lands, mounted a relentless defense against the advancing U.S. troops. Custer's forces, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, were quickly overwhelmed. Each skirmish became a horrific slaughter, and the battlefield was drenched in blood. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is remembered not only as a military defeat, but as a powerful symbol of Native Americans' rightful struggle to preserve their way of life and homeland. Both U.S. soldiers and Native Americans suffered immense losses, with hundreds losing their lives in this bloody conflict. This tragedy remains a testament to the fierce resistance of the Native peoples. The impact of this battle extended far beyond that fateful day. In the years that followed, the U.S. government used this defeat as justification for further restricting Native rights and forcibly removing them from their lands. Little Bighorn stands as one of the most painful chapters in American history. If you want to learn more about this epic and tragic battle, as well as other unforgettable conflicts in American history, make sure to check out the other videos on our channel. From the Battle of Sekigahara to Hulagu Khan's siege of Baghdad, from the fierce fighting at Omaha Beach to Julius Caesar's defeat at Gergovia, we've explored many pivotal moments in history. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the videos, and join the discussion in the comments below. And if you know someone who shares a passion for history, be sure to share these powerful stories with them.